begin disassembly, place the Lambretta on a workbench. And remove the side panels. Remove the right side rear floorboard by removing the two nuts from the crossbar, and the right screw in the bridge piece, and the nuts and bolts holding the upper floorboard support. Then remove the exhaust by loosening the exhaust clamp and the three nuts holding the muffler to the case cover. Unscrew the oil drain plug and let the oil drain into an appropriate container. Unhook the clutch cable from its lever on the crankcase. Now you can remove the crankcase cover by unscrewing the remaining 13 bolts. The thin washers can be removed using a magnet. We are now inside the crankcase, where we have the pinion gear and the drive chain with its upper and lower guides. To remove the clutch discs, you'll need to attach the clutch tool to the crankcase and then turn clockwise to compress the clutch springs. Unhook the spring C-ring. Remove the clutch discs and springs. Power is transferred to the discs via the internal bell housing that's mounted directly on the primary drive. Now you will need to prop up the rear of the scooter a few inches off the ground using a stable support such as this one. To remove the nut on the internal bell housing, you'll have to use an inner bell holder that prevents the housing from turning while loosening the nut. You can now remove the internal bell housing by using the inner bell extractor, then the external bell and the bearing cage. The transmission is located behind this flange. Removing the two bolts, take the upper and lower guides and the drivetrain. Unscrew the 6 bolts holding the flange in place. Use a flathead screwdriver and the 2 extractors to help pry the flange off evenly. The surface of the first gear has teeth that the kickstart gear located inside the crankcase cover uses to turn the engine. The primary gears are always in contact with the secondary. These gears shift along the lay shaft by means of a cursor controlled by this lever. To remove the hub, remove the rear axle bolt and use the rear hub puller to back it out. To remove the rear axle, just tap it with the rubber mallet from the wheel side. To remove the rear shock, remove these two nuts. Remove the rubber bumper from the top of the crankcase. The engine can be lifted into position by using the shock's two mounting bolts so that the cylinder head is facing as far down as possible. Now remove the left side passenger floorboard by removing the 4 mounting nuts and bridge piece screw. Loosen the connectors holding the carburetor to the manifold and air filter. Remove the choke and throttle cables and remove the whole assembly, including the filter. Remove the spark plug. Remove these nuts and slide off the cylinder cover. Remove these 4 nuts and slide the cylinder head, gasket, and the cylinder. To remove the piston, first remove the C-clips and then push out the wrist pin. In order to remove the flywheel cover, you'll need to remove the 5 bolts holding it on. The flywheel dust cover is removed by unscrewing the 2 bolts or removing this C-ring, depending on what type of flywheel you have. Anchor the flywheel using the proper tool and remove the center nut. And finally, remove the flywheel using a flywheel puller. If the timing on the bike is correct, then it's recommended that you mark the position of the stator plate on the flywheel housing to avoid having to readjust the timing after reassembly. Unhook the wires coming from the magneto from the junction box and remove these 3 mounting bolts. To extract the flywheel flange, first unscrew its 3 mounting bolts and then remove the flange using the extractor. To remove the primary drive sprocket, block the crank and remove the nut and pull the sprocket off. You can now remove the crank by tapping on it with the rubber mallet from the drive side. At this point, if you need to remove the engine from the bike, you would unhook it from these 2 bolts. Here's a diagram of the engine components and the actual parts themselves below. Now for reassembly. Slide the crank into the crankcase and gently tap it from the flywheel side until it slides into the drive side seal. Install the primary sprocket by blocking the crank and being careful to install the washers in their original positions. Slide the flange back on, tapping it evenly with the rubber mallet, and tighten the 3 nuts. Position the stator plate so that your original markings line up. Otherwise, you will have to reset the timing, which will be explained later in this video. Push the color-coded wires back into the junction box. Now slide the flywheel back on, being careful to align the slot on the inside of the flywheel with the woodruff key on the crankshaft, and tighten the mounting nut back on while holding the flywheel in place. Reinstall the piston, making sure that the rings openings are lined up with the stoppers in the piston's grooves and that the arrow in the piston is lined up with the exhaust manifold. 3 types of cylinders and pistons were used and were accordingly marked with the plus and minus or 0. Make sure the symbol on the cylinder matches that on the piston's head. Slide the cylinder on using a C-ring compressor, taking care not to damage the cylinder gasket. Now it's time to readjust the timing if necessary. You can measure the points gap at their maximum aperture through this opening. Instead of the cylinder head, use a top dead center meter and install it on the cylinder studs. Hook up your test light by attaching one of the wires to the power and the other to the ground. If your Lambretta is a non-battery model, then you will need a battery to power the light. Find top dead center and set the meter to 0. From top dead center, turn on the test light and slowly turn the flywheel left until the light turns off. This is when the points close, and the top dead center meter should be measuring between 2.5 and 3 millimeters of piston travel, or on the flywheel you should see between 32 and 33 millimeters of movement from top dead center. If your points do not close at this point, loosen the stator plate and turn it until they close within this setting. Now replace the dust and flywheel covers. Replace the cylinder head, being careful not to damage the head gasket, and then the cylinder cover. Put in the spark plug and its cap. Install the carburetor with the air element and reattach the throttle and choke cables. Reattach the left rear floorboard. Release the engine so that the cylinder swings upward and push in the rebound buffer. Install the rear shock absorber. Put the sliding dog on the lay shaft and then the spring and ball. Push the lay shaft into the seal and bearings, tapping lightly with the rubber mallet. Place the cone on the axle, then the rear hub. Screw on the rear axle nut without locking it in place. Put the wheel back on and attach it using the acorn nuts. Reinstall the main shaft and slide the gears back onto the lay shaft. Slide the needle bearings on and then the gear flange, being careful to make sure it's laying completely flat using the 6 nuts. Put back the drive chain together with its guides without tightening down the 2 bolts. Remount the external bell housing, the needle bearings, and the internal bell housing. Anchor the internal bell housing and tighten the nut followed by the 2 bolts holding the chain guide. At this point, it's a good idea to check the alignment of the chain using a regular gauge. First, make sure the bell housing is seated properly. Set the gauge to 0 by setting it flat on the rear chain sprocket. Then check the difference on the front sprocket. It should measure from 5 to 20 millimeters more than the rear. The rear housing can be adjusted by adding or removing shims. Replace the clutch springs and discs. Lock the rear axle nut in place. Align the case gasket over the studs and reinstall the case cover. Reattach the clutch cable and remove the rear support. Fill the case with 90 SAE oil until you see it come out of the leveling hole. Install the muffler and then the right side rear floorboard. To check the battery level, remove the two bolts holding it to the frame and add only distilled water to 5 ml over the fill line. This should be done at least once a month and every 2 weeks during the summer. Behind the headlight is a regulator that controls the battery charging rate and its fuse. At this point, it's a good habit to check the column and axle bolts to make sure they're nice and tight. Put the side panels back on. And reassembly is complete.
Il motore potente ed elastico assicura una resa di 6 cavalli e mezzo effettivi. La trasmissione a catena conferisce particolare silenziosità e dolcezza di funzionamento. Il cambio a corsoio a bassa velocità di rotazione ha alte doti di maneggevolezza e selettività. Le ruote di 10 pollici e il molleggio particolarmente studiato conferiscono alla macchina una stabilità e una sicurezza senza precedenti. Ecco la Lambretta 150 Li, lo scooter veloce, elegante, economico.